from Department of Applied Mathematics and Statistics at Case Western Reserve University. And today he'll be talking about the universal description of stochastic oscillators.
Great, thank you, Yangyang. It's been great fun visiting Brandeis so far. This university is where my father did his postdoc with Colin Steele in the chemistry department back in the 1960s before I was born. So, and I've never been here before, so it's cool to be here and walk around. They lived halfway between here and BU because my mother was a student at BU and my dad was a postdoc here. So anyway, it's nice to be here. Last time I gave this talk was in Boulder, Colorado, University of Colorado, and there's this cafe they take all the visitors to for breakfast, and up on one wall, there's like this amazing display of all these clocks. And so since I'm going to be talking about oscillators, which are like clocks, although not very good ones, they're sort of noisy clocks, that's what this graphic is for. Okay, I promised there would be pictures. That might be the last interesting picture, but okay. So before I go further, we have until 1, or when should I aim? I probably have too much material, so I can decide how much to cut out. What's our upper limit? 1:10 is when the next class files in. So, okay. So I love it if people ask questions. That makes me know that you're not here just for the pizza. If nobody asks questions, I'll probably finish right on time. If people ask questions, I'll cut out some stuff, and it'll be a better talk. So these are my colleagues with whom I've done the most recent version of this work. The talk has 2 halves. One is sort of background, and then there's more, which some of you may have heard at conferences, I don't know, but most of you probably haven't. And then there's the most recent work, which is based on a paper that came out last summer in PNAS, which is called A Universal Description of Stochastic Oscillators, and that's the title of the talk. So Alberto, Boris, and Benjamin are my very excellent collaborators on this project, and I acknowledge my funding sources. Okay, so let's get into it. So stochastic oscillations occur in all sorts of situations. This is a mathematical biology seminar, and so these are all different examples. So you've got these little hair bundles in your ear that spontaneously vibrate. Some people have reported if you listen closely to the ear of your dog, it is actually making musical notes. There's these spontaneous oscillations. It's really weird and cool, but they're hypersensitive and they help us hear with more acuity. So that's one kind of stochastic oscillation. Nerve cells, some of us are interested in neuroscience, and so you've got all kinds of things that perturb the regular firing patterns of nerve cells, channel noise, network input, different things. So here's you can see these oscillations are fairly regular, but not exactly regular. Flowing fluids. I was talking with Jonathan about the cilia doing this thing and pushing fluid along. So apparently he's looking at some data where there's noisy oscillations that are actually doing physical work, driving things around. And quasi-cycles. Anybody know what quasi-cycles are? So quasi-cycles are noisy oscillations where there isn't a limit cycle. I'll say it a little bit more later about what a limit cycle is, but if you just have, in this case, predator-prey dynamics, if you write down the ordinary differential equation system, there's a fixed point, everything converges to the fixed point, there's no oscillations. But because the population is finite, you have random effects involving exactly how many wolves eat exactly how many rabbits or whatever, and those noisy or finite population effects lead to sustained oscillation, even though without noise, there wouldn't be any oscillation. So those things are called quasi-cycles. One of the ways that physicists and people who look at data, biologists, quantitative biologists, would analyze these systems would be by looking at the power spectrum. So here's an example. This is if you take the Fourier transform of your signal and you look at the power in it at different frequencies, you get a nice strong peak here, And likewise, even though this system, this quasi-cycle, doesn't have a deterministic limit cycle, it also has a nice strong power spectrum. And what I hope to get across today is that we have a way of mapping all different kinds of noisy oscillators onto a common framework that make sense of things like the fact that linear systems, nonlinear systems often have things like similar power spectra, for example. Okay, so oh, I see. I'm blocking my own. So you can actually see this stuff that I don't want you to see up here. Well, okay, that's not bad. All right, so there's many different underlying physical mechanisms that can lead to oscillations. And one of the barriers to understanding them in some global sense has been the fact that you can get similar kinds of oscillations out of very different kinds of mechanisms. For example, you can take a limit cycle. So if I take the noise away, this is a fairly simple system that would just do a Landau oscillator that would just go around like a clock. Like that clock back there. But if you add noise, then the oscillations get irregular. The cool thing about this paper is if you have enough noise, the clock actually goes backwards. We're not going to do that. Now, excitable systems is something that you see in some neural systems. For instance, a nerve cell is just sitting below threshold, and if it gets enough of a random tick, then it'll fire a spike, and then go back to resting, and then it'll fire another spike. And if you took the noise away, there would be no regular pattern of activity. But with the presence of noise, you do get regular firing. So you can get noisy oscillations out of excitable systems with noise included. This is a cool example, a heteroclinic cycle. This is just a vector field. You can see the deterministic trajectory moving around like this. There's a saddle point in each corner. In the middle, there's an unstable spiral source. And this trajectory gets pulled closer and closer to the wall, and it takes longer and longer to go around. I thought of this, it would take longer and longer to go around each corner. So it doesn't have a finite periodic oscillation. But if you add noise, then the noise kicks it out of the corners, and now it has a finite mean period. So completely different mechanism, wouldn't oscillate without noise, no underlying limit cycle. And then this is like a quasi-cycle. This is just a linear vector field. The rate of change of x and y is just some linear combination of x and y that happens to be set up so that the matrix telling you how they change has complex eigenvalues with negative real parts. So things are moving in towards the center. The fixed point is there. You're going to spiral in to the middle, but there's no sustained oscillation. But if you add noise, the noise keeps kicking you away from the center, and then on average, you keep oscillating around and you never settle down to the fixed point. So all of these act to some degree or other like noisy oscillators, but one of them is linear, the rest are nonlinear. Sometimes they depend on noise, sometimes they don't depend on noise. So it's kind of a zoo. All right, so what we sought out to do in our most recent work is to put all these different kinds of oscillators on a common footing. And we think we have been able to do that. But so the second half of the talk will be how we did that. Before I get to that, I want to go over a little bit of other material that's a little bit older work, but it sets the stage. And the first thing is to talk about isochronisms. So if I've got so I see there's a chalkboard and there's erasers. So when I make mistakes, I can erase them. But I'm not going to make any mistakes if I don't have any chalk. Okay, the chalk. I gave a talk at the University of Kansas in Lorentz, and it was the first talk they'd have after the pandemic in person, and like they had to search the whole building for chalk. Right? Because in 2 years, nobody had actually written on it. So I'm just thinking about a dynamical system like a system of differential equations. Doesn't have to be in 2 dimensions, but it's easier to draw pictures. And I'm supposing that there's a limit cycle, so that this is a periodic orbit where if I go around by a certain time period, then I come back to where I started, and it's going to be stable, meaning that if I start from different points, they're going to converge to the limit. And now I can I can ask for the set of points that would all converge to the same trajectory, the same point with the same timing, and those surface made of those points is called an isochron. And the idea of isochrons goes back to this great paper by Winfrey. I reread it last night. Everybody should read this paper because he proposes some really cool experiments that we should all be doing with our models. Anyway, so he asked about the properties of these sets that all behave with the same timing. And so the next year, John Guggenheimer published a paper in the Journal of Mathematical Biology. This was all in the first issue, the first year of the Journal of Mathematical Biology, answering yes based on results of invariant manifold theory. There are things called isochrons that sort of smoothness properties and so on. And there's two equivalent ways to define the isochrons. You can either ask for the set of points such that, so if this is trajectory number 1 and trajectory number 2, and there's my limit cycle trajectory, all three of them converge to each other. They're all converging to the limit cycle. They also have to converge to each other. Whereas if I started with, we don't have different positions. If I took a different set of points, those wouldn't converge to these points because they're on different points in the limit cycle, but they would converge mutually to each other. So you can define these surfaces with equal time, isochrons, equal time, in terms of the long-term behavior. But alternatively, you can say, I would like to have a surface with the property that wherever I start on that surface, if I go around exactly one period later, I end up on the same surface exactly one period later. Okay, so you can either look one period in the future or you can look infinitely far in the future. And both ways give you a way of constructing these the exact same set of surfaces. And there has to be a point in the middle that doesn't, where it's not defined, the so-called phaseless point. Okay, so that's the classical background. Now, these curves are the level sets of a function, the asymptotic phase function. And it has the property that if I look at the value of that phase function along the trajectory, it's increasing at a constant rate. So, if it's the voltage of a nerve cell or whatever, it's behaving in some complicated way, but the phase is behaving in a very simple way. So the gradient of that function turns out to be important for understanding how an oscillator responds. If you couple them together, you want to see, do they entrain, meaning they get the same pattern of activity, or if you're driving one, if they synchronize, or if you drive one with a periodic stimulus and you want to know whether it has a certain phase relationship with the stimulus, the gradient of this thing called the phase response curve, or the infinitesimal phase response curve, has been a hugely valuable workhorse in mathematical science. So this phase framework is great, and it's been extended in recent years. Guillemot and Huget, I think, get the nod for sort of getting this framework off the ground, but nobody understood what they were doing until Dan Wilson and Jeff Mullis came along, and they wrote a paper that people could understand, which is basically duplicating Guillemont's paper, as far as I understand it. But anyway, it's all good. They're buddies now. Anyway, you can think of this as a coordinate change, and then you can say, well, what about the coordinates? If it's an n-dimensional system, what about the n-1 other coordinates? So you can find additional coordinate change that my collaborator Alberto, who worked with the Guillemot Huget group, when you change coordinates, your initially complicated nonlinear system now has a much simpler description. It has this phase coordinate, which evolves at a constant rate. What could be simpler than evolving at a constant rate? And then these n-1 other coordinates that all just behave linearly. All these kappas are negative, at the rate of contraction along different directions. So if you know about Cloquet analysis, it's related to that in a way. And so now we've turned this nonlinear thing into a bunch of linear things, and a constant thing, and life is good. Problem is, for stochastic oscillators, it all goes out the window. If you have stochastic oscillators, so I'm going to flip ahead to a picture to help make this point. So I said a bunch of this stuff. Okay, here's a picture of isochrons from an actual conducting space neural model. I have too much material, so I'm gonna move along. Oh, the gradient of the phase function proved to be important for understanding entrainment and synchronization, but only as long as the effects of the other things in the system don't push you too far away from the it's a linear approximation. If you get pushed pretty far away, then it helps to have these other, to take at least the coordinate that decays the slowest is the one that's going to be the most important. Ones that decay fast, you can ignore them. But take the one that decays the slowest. This sigma is the same thing as, so Wilson calls it isostable. The other people call it sigma. It's the same thing. But the gradient of that first transverse coordinate gives you an even better grasp on things like synchronization. So that framework has been under sort of extension recently. Here's a little illustration. So I've got my isochrons, and then the isostable is if I find all the points with the same isostable value, and I let the whole thing is rotating like this, but there's like this outer red circle is contracting all at the same rates. Okay, so it's like that shape is just exponentially contracting down to the That's what the isostable coordinate is doing. All right, so if things are noisy, then well, if they're not noisy, you can take a bunch of points in the same isochron, and they go around and around. They all converge to the same point, and then all the orange ones are converging to this one. But if there's noise, if everybody's getting independent noise, then of course they smear out. You can see the red ones are more over here, the blue ones are more over there. So it takes time to spread out around the ring, but if you go to very long times, eventually there will be a stationary distribution where everybody is like salt and pepper, obviously. And so you can't use this definition where you say, well, find all the points that are converged to each other, are going to converge to each other at long times, because they don't converge to each other. You can't use this other definition, like find me a set of surfaces where I come around in exactly time t. The t might not even be the same. The noise might change the period. The time it takes to go around is now a random variable. So it's a mess. And I tackled this from one perspective with Benjamin Lindner a number of years ago, about 10 years ago. We started working on this. And the idea is, instead of looking at the trajectories, which are problematic for these reasons, we think about the density, the probability distribution of where the particle might go, and we look at how that would go. So the density just means the density at x and time t is the probability of finding capital X here is a random trajectory, a random variable. Probability of finding that in some neighborhood near x size dx, you divide by the volume, so probability divided by volume gives you a probability density. And it evolves according to a linear evolution equation in infinite dimensions. For a linear evolution equation, even though the underlying dynamics might be nonlinear, the way the density moves is linear. Right?
Yeah, on the previous slide. So,
on the previous slide, yeah.
yeah, I was just so I see that really the distribution of phases in the stochastic system is not uniform.
Right.
And I was thinking about it. Should that is it related? So do we understand it? And the red is it related to the fact that the system is so fast? I mean, I was just wondering, is there an understanding of the eventual phase distribution?
So there's a unique stationary distribution in the jointly describing the two variables. In this case, it's just two variables. If I make any coordinate change I like, that new observable or new value will have some distribution. So then you can ask, well, if you were defining phase as going from say 0 to 2 pi, should the phase have a uniform distribution once this thing settles down into steady state, or is there a non-uniform distribution? And generally, the phase does not have to be uniform. That's not a defining property of the phase. There's different ways of defining the phase, but that's not a requirement.
Is it fair to think about the green, for instance? We can barely see any green, and that may be the fact that the phases were changing very quickly.
No, that's just because of the order in which I plotted the points.
Oh, I see.
So the green ones are covered up by the that's it.
Okay, but it's also
Yeah. All the density is or probability is conserved.
for each one.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. No, the green ones haven't disappeared. They're just hidden. They're obscured just as an artifact of plotting.
And they are all delocalized all throughout this.
Well, no, I've only run this for 15 periods. Okay, so it hasn't I can still tell that the ones over here more likely started out on this side than on that side, right? I like to use this analogy because I developed this stuff when I was with Benjamin Lindner in Berlin. And in Berlin, my kids were little then, and Berlin has these great water parks. And one of the things they have in the water parks is this circular, like an annulus full of water. It's a continuous river, and they make it flow around and around and around. And the kids get in there. It's the river carries you around, but you come back into it. So imagine you take a crate full of rubber ducks, and you go to this circular river thing. You dump the rubber ducks. They're going to bounce around, and they're going to be carried by the flow, and they're going to come back, a minute later, kind of the way they were. And then, but if you come back like 10 minutes later, they've spread out. If you come back an hour later, they've spread out, but they haven't spread out uniformly. If you come back a week later, if somebody hasn't fished the ducks out yet, they'll be completely distributed evenly, and you won't know which part of the pool you were standing on when you dumped them in. But if you come back after an intermediate period of time, it'll look like the density will look like a sinusoid that's decaying. It's just like the fusion with period or the heat equation with periodic boundaries, right? The sign of the fundamental is the slowest one, the last one to go. That slowest decaying mode, it corresponds to a particular eigenfunction of the operator, and that's the thing we're going to focus on. So I'm glad you asked the question. Okay, so you've got this density description, and you've got this operator that tells you how the densities evolve in time. And for example, if I've got a stochastic difference equation where this is the mean drift and this is the noise term, then this operator would have this particular form. In this case, it would be the Fokker-Planck operator. And it describes how probabilities move forward in time. Now, there's another operator related to it that has the same eigenvalues called the adjoint operator. And if this was a discrete state probability problem, and we just had a matrix describing how probabilities move, we would take a transpose matrix to describe how the means of observables change. Likewise, in this case, the formal adjoint of the Fokker-Planck operator, which is also called Kolmogorov's forward operator, Kolmogorov's backward operator, would look like this. You sort of, when you do integration by parts, things move around. These, with appropriate boundary conditions, these operators have the same eigenvalues. This happens to also be the Koopman operator, although we didn't know that when we started. The Koopman operator for stochastic system. It's also called the generator of Markov process. This operator has eigenfunctions, and the eigenfunction corresponding to the complex eigenvalue that is decaying the slowest, the least negative real part, that is the thing that naturally generalizes the notion of phase. Or that's our candidate. There's more than one candidate, but that's what we propose as the thing that generalizes phase to stochastic systems. And so I want to make sure I get to the new material. This is also the old material. So, for example, here's a conducted space model with 100 potassium gates. So there's this axis is discrete, so not the Fokker-Planck, just a discrete discrete state this way, continuous state this way. You can write down the Kolmogorov operator. It's kind of fun to do that. You can diagonalize it numerically. You get this nice parabolic eigenvalue spectrum. If you just had the rubber ducks, you just had diffusion in periodic boundary conditions, but in a rotating coordinate frame, you would expect exactly a parabolic spectrum. Okay, so it fits beautifully. Here's the slowest decaying complex conjugate pair. If I change the noise, so if I make the noise larger, then the whole spectrum shifts, and the frequency didn't change much when I increase the noise, but the decay rate. So the coherence doesn't matter with the There's also real eigenvalues, and those are going to turn out to be important later. But I'm going to skip over that right now. Okay, you can do this with deterministic systems, but I don't want to take the time for that. Right. So if I take this complex conjugate pair of eigenvalues, and I look at the eigenfunction is going to be complex. So I can write the eigenfunction as a modulus times e to the I something. Okay, so I can write it as the modulus times e to the I and something which goes from 0 to 2 pi. If I plot the level curves of that thing, those are plotted in black and red for the two different noise levels. The isochrons for the deterministic system are plotted in blue. This has a limit size in this particular case. But this framework also is going to apply for systems that don't have an underlying limit size. But in the case where it does have an underlying limit size, you can see they're similar. They're not exactly the same, but they're similar to the isochrons. So that was evidence. We thought that this was a good way to extend the notion of isochrons to stochastic systems. And now, okay, so we can do it for this system. Doesn't oscillate without noise, but you can do the same thing. You get the eigenvalue spectrum. The leading eigenvalues are a complex conjugate pair. You can plot the level curves of that psi function, the complex argument. This is for, again, two different noise levels. It's interesting that the higher noise level, the pitch of the curve is less, and for the lower noise level, it's tighter. You can imagine if you made the noise smaller and smaller, it would get infinitely tight and somehow break, because the thing doesn't work if you don't have any noise. You can also do it with the spiral sink. So we have a paper where we calculated the eigenfunctions. So in the case of the linear spiral sink, you can solve the Fokker-Planck equation exactly. It's the one case where you can solve it exactly. And so you can write down the eigenfunctions, and they look like the level curves. Because they have to be the spokes of a wheel, but the density of the spokes is different in different directions. And so that's cool, because without the noise, you don't get an oscillation, you can't define isochrons. With the noise, it acts like an oscillator, and now all of a sudden you can define isochrons. Okay, so back to isostables. So we also yeah, so to get something that acts like an isostable, remember the isostables are the things in the deterministic setting, they're the coordinates that decay the constant. Well, nothing is going to be that simple, but we could ask for the expected rate of decay to be linear. And if we discovered, this is what Alberto Perez, when he joined us, what he discovered was that if you take an eigenfunction of the backward operator, dagger, theta equals minus kappa eta, that eigenfunction has exactly this property, because the rate of change of the expectation of something is given by the backward operator. It's just one of the things the backward operator does, is it tells you the expected rate of change of an observable. It's something called Dinkin's theorem, Dinkin's formula. So, yes.
The equation on the station of the on the left hand side is
so x is the trajectory, x is the stochastic trajectory. So I say, well, where is x now? I condition on where x is now, and then I ask for the input over the next little bit of time. And that increment is going to be a random variable. It's going to, right, there's going to be multiple possible ways you can go. So I can ask, what's the average of where it is delta t right here? And so if I plug it into the isostable function, or this real eigenfunction, and then I ask, where does that eigenfunction go next? That behaves as if I was just doing exponential decay.
So shouldn't you have an expectation for that? I mean, I'm just reading the stochastic for that.
Yeah, this is the expectation, the conditional expectation conditioned on
the
X.
position. Okay.
And that's the condition.
Advanced.
I could have written it. Yeah,
Okay,
I could have written it more precisely. Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, so right. So now we have at least for a two-dimensional oscillator, we have a proposal for a change in coordinates. You go into the complex argument of the complex eigenfunction that acts like the phase, and you go into the real eigenfunction, the one that decays the slowest, the one with the least negative part of value. And between those two, you get a description which acts in a lot of ways like the classical isostable, the deterministic phase and isostable with phase interconnection. So that's cool. If I look at the set of points where that eigenfunction is equal to 0, since everything is decaying, on average, that's the point that all the trajectories converge towards. And so we thought that might be a candidate for the stochastic limit cycle. So we wrote in the first draft of the paper, we've discovered how to define stochastic limit cycles. And the referee said, no, you haven't. So we took it out, which is a good thing because in recent weeks, Alberto has come up with counterexamples where this set doesn't sit where the typical trajectories are. And we're trying to understand it. So it's that's in a relaxation oscillator that we don't completely understand. All right, so here's pointing out some of the real eigenvalues, but I want to take enough time for this is just showing that in fact the mean behavior decays exponentially, as you would expect it on this log scale. That straight line up there in B is confirming numerically that we get this linear decay. That's true for different systems. And okay, so that's the end of part 1. So the point is that we have ways to generalize oscillator phase and stable coordinates for stochastic systems. If you analyze the densities instead of the trajectories, that can be helpful. The phase is related to the slowest decaying oscillatory mode, and then the isostables, so to speak, are related to the slowest decaying real mode. So that's great. And then about a year ago or two, about a year ago, Benjamin and Alberto started kicking around the idea, well, why don't we analyze not just the phase itself, but the Q function, the whole that whole eigenfunction. And okay, so that led to this paper. Maybe it was 2 years ago they started. So what do I want to say? Okay, so this repeats a little bit of what I've already said. So basic framework is that we have if you have a deterministic system, you can define the phase. You can define the isostables, and that's what I've already shown you. And then I'll build the analogy in a moment to the stochastic system. So, right. So if I've got my deterministic system, I do this coordinate transformation where I've got phase and different isostables. And I look at this and I say, remember from Sesame Street? If I exponentiate this, then they all look the same. Right? If I write e to the I theta, if I write e to the I theta, then the sigma dt is kappa times sigma for everything And the first cap, the kappa that goes with this is I. So the decay rate is 0. The decay rate is transverse to this like constant because it's like if you're not decaying in the phase, you just take away the real thing. And so now all of those are on the same basis, right? And they're all eigenfunctions of the Koopman operator. So this thing that we were looking at before, the eigenfunction for the stochastic case, we write it as magnitude times PPI phase variable. That's an eigenfunction of the Koopman operator, too. And so you got the just eigenfunctions of the Koopman operator, either with real eigenvalues or complex eigenvalues. So it all goes in the same framework. All right, so in the stochastic system, we've got the probability density, which now I'm calling P instead of rho. It has an adjoint. We assume that we can diagonalize it, so we have eigenvalues and eigenfunctions. There's a unique stationary distribution, etc. And I talked already about the asymptotic phase with this, but this is the function here, Q1. We're going to look at the properties of that function, not separating out of phase, but including the magnitude of it. And that was the big breakthrough. So, okay, so I'll skip the definitions unless people ask about them. So, all right. So this function Q, what's so great about it? Well, so if you don't take the phase out, but you take the complex eigenfunction itself, the description of that, if you look at it as a change of coordinates, is incredibly simple. It just evolves linearly. It means that you can take the Q function for this oscillator, the Q function from that oscillator, and this other oscillator, all the different mechanisms, and now you can compare them all, because what you're doing is you're looking at do they have the same eigenvalues, and then the differences between them are encoded in the Q function, but the timing and decay and coherence and all that stuff is in the eigenvalues. And we have in this paper we also included two weakly coupled oscillators, and we have, I wouldn't say a complete theory, but we have the beginnings of a theory for that as well, exploiting this Q function stuff. So here's some of the cool things you can do with the Q function. On the very first slide, I showed you the oscillating hair bundles and the quasi-cycles, and I mentioned the power spectrum. So you can calculate the power spectrum for the Q function. If you have a nonlinear stochastic system, there's no way you can calculate the spectrum, the power spectrum. Benjamin and I had one paper where we did do it for the heteroclitic oscillator, and it was a ton of work. We had to dissect it in funny ways. It's really hard. But if you make this nonlinear transformation to the Q function, the power spectrum, so the correlation function, it just decays linearly with the real part of the eigenvalue and the imaginary part just showing up. So it just has a oscillatory decay, just like the rubber ducks in the rotating water thing. The density is going to approach the stationary distribution with a decaying oscillation, sinusoidal. But the same thing is true for an arbitrary oscillator if you use the right coordinates, namely the eigenfunction, those coordinates. So if this is the correlation function, you can find the power spectrum. Power spectrum is like this. It's just a pure Lorentz. This is the power spectrum you would get for like an Oscillators process. Like the very simplest thing you could hope for is what you see if you use the eigenfunction with the changing coordinates. Linear response. You can take so here's another way of writing the stochastic oscillator. There's F, and here's G, and that's white noise. And then let's add a forcing function in a particular direction. So E is going to be the direction you push it. A small forcing function, and P is some periodic function over time. The way you respond is what you hope for is that you can get a linear response function saying that the behavior is just that forcing function convolved with some kind of function. So if you have a purely linear system, like if you did systems theory as an engineer, and this is the kind of thing you'll be looking for. Well, if you look for the average response of the Q1 function, without the forcing, the average is 0. That's just because it's orthogonal to the stationary mode, which is the different eigenvalue. If you ask for the average behavior, this is not an approximation, this is an exact expression. And when it comes again out of the fact that this is an eigenfunction of and this kernel is just exponential detected using the eigenfunction, the eigenvalue that goes with that eigenfunction. So this is true for all the eigenfunctions, but the one that has the slowest decay, we think, is the one that's most physically meaningful. If I take two eigenfunctions, I can get their cross spectra analytically. So that's helpful. And then later, when we couple, later meaning in 30 seconds, because I'm running out of time, when you couple two oscillators together, if you describe each one using their eigenfunctions, then the cross terms involve a sum of cross spectra from the two different oscillators. And so the fact that we can calculate the correlation or the cross correlation of two different eigenfunctions is a technical thing that's very helpful. Okay, so we tried this out with a bunch of different examples. The damped harmonic oscillator, that's just a linear system plus noise. Stewart-Landau is this thing that's like just a plain old clock. And then a SNCC, a saddle node invariant circle system, that's related to something like an excitable neuron. And so in each case, you know, you can write down equations that look very different. The mechanism of oscillations is very different. The trajectories look very different. But if you look at the trajectory over time, they look totally different. But we tuned them so they all had the same leading eigenvalue. And now the power spectra look like this. So they where the power is large, if I just look at where the power is large, they agree very well. And the correlation is the same decaying oscillation. So viewed through the lens of the Q function, they all have similar behavior. I can increase the noise level, and so now you can see that the trajectories look really messed up. These are still oscillators, but by increasing the noise level, the eigenvalues have moved to the left, and the ratio between the imaginary part, which is the oscillation, and the real part, which is the decay, that ratio has changed, and it's called the quality factor. So engineering physicists talk about the quality factor of an oscillation. Basically, how coherent is the oscillation over time? How rapidly does the coherence go away relative to the frequency of the oscillation? So to make it noisier, the quality factor is lower. And the correlation function, you can see they decays faster, and you still have a peak at the same point. Okay. I already put that. I already showed you that. Okay. So actually, on these figures, I was plotting the correlation functions of the components, not of Q1. Right. And the point is that these are different. But if I now plot in the Q1 as my coordinates, now everything is the same. So now in Q1, they're all the less coherent is broader compared to the height. The ratio of those two things is another way to measure the quality factor. Okay, and I am just about out of time. I said that already. Looks like I have some duplicate slides here. Okay, so the last thing, so the linear response involves an expression that takes the expected value of the gradient of this function, dot product with the thing that tells you the direction of pushing. So those of you who are familiar with the lore of phase response curves know that when you want to know how an external perturbation affects an oscillator, you take the dot product between the gradient of phase and the perturbation. that's basically what this is. If Q1 is an analog of the phase response, its gradient response, you take the inner product with the direction that you're forcing it, that shows up in the description of the linear response function. So that's a step towards having an infinitesimal phase response curve for first advanced oscillators. Is defined from first principles. All right, so that's probably that's probably yes. So we can calculate the susceptibility and the phase when we drive with external perturbations. The theory matches the experiments. The cross spectra theory works pretty well most of the time. And that's, I should probably stop here, and that way there's many questions. So, so if we instead of thinking about phase and entropy separately, if we just take that eigenfunction itself, then it has all these great properties. Its correlation function is pure exponential decay. The power spectrum is a pure Lorentzian. The linear response function is just convolution of the decaying exponential. And you get a good approximation for weakly coupled oscillators. So you can read all about that in this paper. And I'll stop here so we have 5 minutes for questions, and you should all have your questions. I'm just going to glance at Zoom to see if there's anybody left who might have questions. So if Paul is there, he gets the first question. And if he's not there, that's okay. So questions are here. Yes. Go ahead.
Does this technique work well for oscillators near explosions?
Well, what is a kind? So you've got this deterministic trajectories that track along unstable manifold, and then they're extremely sensitive. So what's going to happen if I take a system that has a canard and then I add a little bit of this?
I mean, I can tell you what I've seen in these scenarios, but
Yeah. So what do you?
yeah. So if you're, I've seen that I studied the oscillator a little bit, and when it's just below its canard explosion, and you add a little bit of noise, you take these excited oscillations. You jump from low to high, or if you're a bit above, sometimes in terms of things.
Do you get like a mixture of large oscillations and small oscillations?
Yes, yeah.
Okay, good. So in unpublished work, we have observed that, so for example, like with the Morris-Sakar model or the Fitzgerald model, as you vary a parameter, you can go to a subcritical hot bifurcation. And so below the bifurcation, you get decaying oscillations, and above, you get large spikes. So what I've seen numerically, and I haven't found the right student to pursue this yet, but maybe you're that student, would be that for one value of the parameter that's going to push you across, you get this would be the slower oscillation, this would be the faster one, right? This is frequency. You would get that as the leading terms in the eigenvalue spectrum. And then when you're, so let's see, this would be when you're below the bifurcation and the subthreshold oscillations dominate because they're more coherent because they correspond to the anyway. So there's a change in the eigenvalue spectrum as you vary the parameter, and then there's a point where the assumptions that we make that I kind of skipped over are that there's only one complex pair that's sort of separated from the rest of the spectrum. When you've got these two competing oscillations in the data, what we've seen is that these eigenvalues, as you vary the parameter, they're moving this way and these are moving that way. And then eventually they all have the same decay rate. And so now you've got two different frequencies that are part of the same description. And that's probably what's happening in that case. Whether that's a generic feature of systems with a canard, I don't know. but that is what I would expect to see if you have these mixed mode behaviors, where you have both subthreshold or both small and large oscillations. Yeah. Yeah. Other questions?
Can check the chat. Paul has a question.
Oh, Paul has a question in the chat. Excellent. Okay.
Hi, I guess I can ask it if you can hear.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Right. So Jonathan's earlier question about whether it reaches steady state of uniform distribution around phase. So does the eigenvalue, does this eigenfunction tell you the steady state distribution
No,
in
no,
phase,
no.
or
The steady state distribution is the first eigenvalue
okay,
is
got
0,
it.
and that gives you the steady state distribution, and everything you want to know about steady state, like the average of this and the average of that, would be calculated, or average currents and that sort of thing would be based on that. All these other
Got it.
modes will eventually decay if you wait long enough.
Yeah.
But
Okay.
these other modes tell you about the approach to the equilibrium, which will be oscillatory if it's a stochastic oscillator kind of situation.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
Yep, good question. Okay. Other questions? Yeah. go ahead.
So one said that the gradient of the star is
Yeah, the expected gradient of Q star shows up when you do the linear response. Meaning when you ask for the average response to a sustained periodic with a weak sustained periodic. So if you ask that question for the deterministic oscillator, the phase response curve would show up in the same point in the expression. So that's one. The phase response curve also shows up if you look at synchronization in lots of other contexts. And I can't say at this point that it's going to work out the same way. So this is one analogy that seems to work. But there might be different nuances because, as I said in the beginning, the two definitions that Gutkenheimer gave of the deterministic phase, one based on asymptotic behavior and one based on one period later behavior, they break down. They also give different generalizations. So you can ask for a system of surfaces where the average return time to that system, that surface is the same. And that gives a different definition of the asymptotic phase. No, the isochrons for the spectral decomposition, for the eigenfunction decomposition, they violate that average return time property by a little bit. We have a paper where we studied the two different definitions side by side, and the difference between the two isochrons is very small, but it's real. They satisfy different equations, and it's sort of, as you might expect, it's largest when you're close to the phases. So that's another legitimate way of defining the phase that gives you something which is mathematically different and different, quantitatively different, and qualitatively almost the same in all these. And so there might be different, depending on whether you're looking at synchronization. Depending on the question you ask, different notions of phase might be the right answer. And so we still don't know. We have a classroom. Okay. Well, thank you all for sticking around. I'm amazed that nobody left, but okay. Thank you, Paul, for attending remotely. And I guess I'll talk to you later.
Right. Thank you for the talk, and see you tomorrow.
Yeah. Cheers.